Welcome to Your Family Dog, a podcast dedicated to helping families love living with dogs. Here are your hosts, Julie Fudge Smith and Colleen Pilar.
Hi, welcome back to Your Family Dog. I'm Colleen Pilar, and as always, joined with Julie Fudge Smith. But today we're inviting Jennifer Shryock, who is the founder of Family Paws Parent Education, to join us. And Family Paws has a number of programs that focus particularly on really young kids, right? Starting from, the moment of birth through toddlerhood. But Jen herself is a parent of 4 and has gone through the teenage years a number of times. And so Julie and I have both done that too. And today we wanted to talk about big kids, teenagers. So welcome, Jen. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, Jen, my question for you is, people think, well, once my kid's a teenager, what's the big deal? I mean, he's old enough to, he should be able to walk the dog and feed the dog and do all these things. But I actually think there's some special considerations that need to be taken with teens and dogs. And I wondered if you thought so too, and if so, what would those be?
Lots of considerations, lots and lots of considerations. So a couple of things that come to mind are expectations that kids have. I can think right about a situation last week, in fact. Teen boys coming over, and we have a very large dog, and they want to play with him a certain way. And so I'm always saying, let's get him a toy. Let's do this, not use our hands. Let's not, their idea of playing with him is definitely not my way of playing with him. And in fact, is everything that I discourage when playing with him. So trying to find the ways to communicate that and make it fun for them to engage with my dog in a way that they're going to respect, understand, and do, even if I'm not home, right? Even if my kids are here with their friends when I'm not here. If I just say don't do that, then chances are when I'm not here, they're all going to do that.
So there's a certain level of education where you have to say that, I want you to play with my dog, but you need to understand how to play with my dog. And I found that the same thing when with my Bingley, who was a champion fetch player and would literally go for 7 hours. He would wear the teenagers out. Yeah. But I had a strict rule that he was not to catch in the air because I didn't want any limbs or back problems. And so I had to say, this is how you throw. If you want to throw the ball, make sure it bounces, this kind of thing, to give them really specifics on how to throw the ball. And then you can throw it as long as you can keep up with Bingley is what it boiled down to. But you're right. You need to give them not just the don't do, but this is what you can do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another thought that comes to mind, and I had this with a family, is multiple dogs. Having multiple dogs, and say they have some resource guarding issues or some tendencies to guard food or different items. And you have a child who's coming home to an empty house, no parents in the house, and they have to negotiate that a little bit. Those are issues as well. A lot of times we put that responsibility on kids, and maybe those circumstances aren't safe or aren't situations that they're going to know how to manage if something escalates, or even what to look for. So that's another worrisome one for me.
I sometimes wonder if we have a tendency to say to our kids, let the dog out, do this, do that, but don't actually give them once again, those specific instructions about how to handle this, or this is what you need to look for as an indication that something may be going wrong. Yeah. It's building that whole sort of, dog-aware generation that you want to do. So the other thing is, I was thinking too about like older teenagers who may come home from college and they have sort of that weekend warrior syndrome with the dog, that the dog may be older and is not used to playing 3 and 4 hours a day. Oh, it's so good to see you again, Buster. Let's go out and play. And they do, they take the dog and the dog does fine, but then he really suffers when the kid goes back to college because, one, I am really sore and tired because I'm 9 years old now and I can't do what you want me to do. So I think making our children aware of as well is what the dog's limitations may be.
Yeah.
And avoiding that weekend warrior syndrome.
Oh, so true. And I don't know, it's, I always see a change in my dog's behavior when my college kids are home. My son in particular loves to cook chicken. And Oliver seems to know that whenever he's home, chicken is to be had from the counter. So I end up having, my son who is like, Mom, the dog stole my food. And I'm going, yep, you walked out of the room for 2 seconds. And then Oliver is like the counter surfer for like 2 weeks afterwards because we unknew what just happened. It's there's difference in behaviors that happen. And I mean, it is kind of comical, and I count on it. Like, I know, okay, he's coming home. Oliver's going to be a little out of sorts. But it is really kind of funny. It's funny to see that predictability. And it's amazing because it reminds us that our dogs do behave very differently with different people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And they know what he associates my son with chicken.
Yeah.
So, off the counter.
And how we expect dogs to learn things so quickly, and yet we as people don't learn things that quickly. So if this had happened with your son once, then it would be a one-time thing. But your son has not yet learned that guarding his chicken is a really good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, not leaving it on the counter is a really good idea. Yeah.
I think the other things that when we have younger children and they're there in our dog, and we either see a child that's uncertain about the dog or the dog is uncertain about a child, I think when the kids are younger, we're much more likely to intervene and say, okay, come on, Frisky, let's go to the office and you can have a Kong and we'll let the kids play with their Legos. But I think when the kids are teenagers, for some reason or another, we stop doing that. And so the dog may not like one of your friends, your son's or daughter's friends, because it doesn't like the way in which that person deals with me.
Yeah.
And so I think it's tough on teenagers to expect your teenager to then turn to their friends and say, stop doing that to my dog. Mm-hmm. I think that puts the teenagers in a really tough situation. So I think parents need to be perhaps aware of the fact that it's okay for them perhaps to hover at first when people are arriving to find out who the dog is and is not comfortable with. And so that they can step in and say, hey, I'm sorry, Jason, but Frisky is apparently not feeling like playing right now. I'm just going to take him with me.
Yep.
And I think for some reason we stop advocating, thinking our teenagers have the ability to advocate for our dogs with their friends. And I think that puts our teenagers in a very awkward situation with their friends.
It is. And I'm thinking about a specific situation with my daughter and her boyfriend. And he loves to play with dogs in kind of, a little more rough and tumble way. And so I do take my dogs separate. I do move them out of the room and do separate them and do give them an out and a different option. And it helps. It relieves her of the stress of having to say, yeah, let's not do that, or my mom's going to get irritated. So I just kind of play the bad guy and say, okay, everybody upstairs, we're going up for our time. But I don't like to leave my dogs when there's a bunch of kids. I don't care what age they are. The dogs usually go with me.
Right.
And, because it can get strange quickly.
Yes.
I agree.
And, my daughter had 9 of her friends over for game night. And they're all 17-year-old, around 17. And that can get really wild and loud. And just the loudness is too much for the dogs. And if they just go to tickle each other, or, 17-year-old girls are loud and they don't want a drooling dog on them. It's like, ew, no, ew, And drooling dogs and hairy dogs aren't really their thing. And so when you get a bunch of girls who are kind of, it's true. And, or fear. There are a lot of kids who have fear of dogs too. And when I tell people he's a giant sized dog, they don't believe me until they see him. And then they say, holy cow, that's a big dog. But it really is important to respect and know their comfort level as well, because there are lots of kids who've had exposure to dogs that maybe made them uncomfortable. And even though mine are friendly, that may not necessarily be comfortable for them as well. So I try to get my dogs out of that situation as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really relevant for us to be talking about, because we have 3 dog trainers who've all gone through the teenage years, and we all say when there's any sort of gathering, the dog is with us. And I don't think that that's what most families do. At least not when I talk to my friends about how they manage, because they're surprised that I actually asked the question. How do you manage your dog in that sort of environment? It's like, well, what do you mean? He's just, he does what he does. Like, oh. So I think just the question of, how do we set dogs up for success? How do we keep the dog comfortable? And how do we keep all those kids comfortable is an important point for parents to keep in mind, because I think that we do sort of age out of it and we go like, oh, these kids are big now. We don't have to do this anymore. And I don't think that's true.
We do. We need to have these all the time. I always am having the
By the way, for our listeners, she's waving a Kong around.
Yes, I have a lot of them. And this one's ready to be stuffed because, again, my husband's out of town, and my daughter will have her friends over, and we need to be ready at all times, because that's the other thing with teenagers. They come and go. She's a senior in high school. The schedule's crazy, and kids drop in. Well, I need to be ready when they drop in, Right. So a lot of times I do have her text me ahead of time who's coming. But her group of friends is different than my son's group of friends. And they all behave differently, right? So it's... it's a lot of adjustment. So it doesn't end. It just gets different as they age.
Right. And I think some way we don't want to, I think people forget you still have to parent your teenagers. I mean, you are still their parent and they still need some guidance from you. But moreover, you need to parent your dogs at this point. So even if you don't want to interfere with the teenage fun, you still need to parent and care for the dogs, because teenagers are not parents. And they're not going to step into that role. And to ask them to do that, especially to try and regulate their friends, it's not a fair expectation, I don't think, to have on our kids. I was thinking about when I was pet sitting and somebody had hired me to come in and take care of her cats and her horses, where she and her fiance were traveling, but her kids were home. And she still hired me to come in. So, when we arrived, they had closed the door to the bathroom where the cat's litter box was.
Oh, no.
And and so because one of the cats had explosive diarrhea, so instead of cleaning it up, they closed the door. And they had left food on the counter, so the cats had gotten into shrimp shells.
Oh, boy.
And it was just a mess. And was just a real reminder to me that even when you try to provide for it, sometimes it doesn't work, that there needs to be real supervision going on. And when she found out what had happened, I was so glad I wasn't one of her children. She was justifiably very angry. Yeah. And, because her poor cat was so sick and, so I think that sometimes we don't always realize what's going on. Which brings me to the point of sometimes, especially with teenagers, they're not going to be careful about where they put down their food or their beverages. And so you need to be sure that one of the reasons why you may not want your dogs involved is because if your dog has any kind of food allergies, you certainly don't want them snarfing down the Oreos or the Doritos or whatever it may be. So part and parcel of this could be maintaining sort of a healthier environment for your dog, that they're not exposed to something that they shouldn't be eating or swallowing.
I would agree. I would agree, being that I look in my daughter's room and there's any number of hazards, from makeup to other things. It's true. It's true. And I would just say teenagers, as great as they are very distracted. we're a very distracted society in general now, but I don't know. I don't often I do have some really good pet sitters that I like to rely on, because even if I'm going away for a weekend and my daughter or her kids might be here, I want to be sure we have a backup plan. I want to be sure that if life happens for them and they change plans and haven't thought about the animals, that I've got a backup plan, because that's the life of a teenager, kind of, is, whims, going out on a whim or doing something. And, my dog's needs may not be met. So that's another thought. I think a lot of times we think, oh, the kids will take care of the dogs, but maybe they won't. Maybe they can't. Maybe they're not as reliable. Those are things too. The other age range is preteen that I think about a lot. So I have a 9.5-year-old, who is going through some changes. She's grown and changed in appearance, huge, just in months. So the amount of growing that happens very quickly, you might have friends that visit and your dog knew them, but then they go through puberty and they change, and all of a sudden they look and sound and smell completely different than the other person. Mm-hmm. And I know for gentlemen, this can be really hard because they look very unfamiliar to the dog. Mm-hmm. They change completely. And that does happen quickly. I don't know if you guys found that, but I found it myself. Like, wait a minute, who is this stranger coming into my house? And he sounds completely different, and he looks completely different. So that's all. That can really throw kids off too, because they expect the dog to remember them, and they don't always.
Right. I just remember thinking when my oldest daughter was I don't know, somewhere around 12 or 13. Never underestimate the power of a hormone, because things just happen very quickly. And I think what happens there too is, because things are happening so quickly, they can't always take in all the changes that are happening to themselves. And so they're having a hard time sort of knowing themselves, to then expect them to maintain a certain level of consistency in caring for animals might be an unrealistic expectation at that point as well. Which kind of gets me to the next point I wanted to bring up, is I think that I don't know, maybe you guys haven't heard this, but I certainly have heard that, well, we got the dog because we wanted to teach the child responsibility. Mm. And
definitely heard that.
And yeah, so I have mixed feelings about that.
Yeah.
Because I kind of feel like I understand. You want the child to understand that this is a living creature and you want to teach him compassion and responsibility. But what is appropriate for any given age? And what's appropriate for teenagers? What can we realistically expect of our teenagers as far as taking care of the family pet? And I think a lot of it depends on the teenager and their interests. But I think sometimes we overestimate that as well. What if football practice runs late and I can't get home to feed, Fido at 5 p.m.?
That's right.
Or football practice runs late and everyone says, let's go out and get hamburgers before we go home. Those pieces too, where you thought someone was coming home right after football practice to let the dog out, but your son and his friends stopped for burgers, which is totally normal, and kids aren't really great pre-planners, so my guys were always doing that kind of thing. I'd get the text, we went out, and then, I'll be home in an hour and a half. And if I wasn't relying on that for a canine potty break, I didn't care. And if I was, I was like, hello? Wait a second, someone's dinner is late and his bathroom break is late.
And especially if your dog is older or has special needs or whatever, it needs a lot more consistency. I mean, it's one thing if you have a 5-year-old dog that has a bladder the size of a basketball, but it's a whole other thing if you have a dog who is diabetic, needs a shot. These kinds of things, you have to be. I think what's hard for parents is to understand, how do I be realistic about who my child is? I want my child to be this. I want to encourage my child. We all want our children to be responsible. We all want our children to rise to the occasion.
Right.
But you need to also be realistic about what kind of occasions can they not rise to? And is it really fair to ask them to do that? And these are questions I think that need to be honestly asked and answered. Because I think if you have, and talk to your kid, I think sometimes you may have expectations that this can be happening without actually talking to your kid about how they feel, what they think they can do. They might have a much more realistic idea of what they feel like they can and cannot do. And if you have that discussion, this is what I'd like you to do. Do you think you can do this? Well, I don't think I can do that, but I could do this.
Right.
Now you've got the kid committed saying, yes, I can do this, which is a commitment way in saying, I'm now committing myself to it rather than having it thrust upon me in a situation that I'm not comfortable with.
Very true. It's very true. And I had I agree. Setting those expectations and boundaries is really important always to make sure that you guys are on the same page, because what you might define and what they might see could be completely opposite or different things. And so especially if you're at work and you want the dog to be put out and you have those expectations so you don't come home to a big mess, defining what that looks like. And then if something goes wrong, what are the solutions? What are the options? What are the different things that we can do to still be successful there for the dog, for the kid as well? Yeah. I'm going through a little bit with my youngest. So she has a lot of mood swings. And what I've noticed too is that can be unfair to dogs, especially when you're really into the mood swing. So I also play protector there. My dogs don't need to be around you when you're screaming or when you're upset or whatever, much like toddlerhood, right?
Right.
Now you know a little bit about what's going on in my house, but it's true. But it's true. Those kinds of moods can be very, especially with dogs that are anxious or a little more into, that can be really hard too, and we can create problems in that regard too. So I'm thinking about that because that's hot on my list right now, and it's one of the things that I'm paying attention to for my animals as well. Yes.
Right. And I think, especially animals that have special needs, you need to be especially aware of that. That might not be an animal that is appropriate to allow your teenager, because what if your teenager comes home to let the dog out, right, but brings a couple of his friends with him?
Yeah.
That might not be the best case scenario for you or your dog.
No. And we're responsible and liable no matter what. If the dog is our dog and, say these kids come home and your dog doesn't recognize them, or they engage in a way that is kind of provoking for our dog or that kind of thing. If an incident happens, we're still the ones responsible. And that's really important to keep in mind. So anytime someone comes in the house, I like to know who they are. I do want to know that I've been around when the dog and that person have been around. I don't like strangers coming in. So making sure you've got those boundaries in place so your dog is successful too is smart.
Right. And one of the things that when I was a pet sitter and I employed pet sitters, one of my things was, you may not take a guest with you if you are taking care of one of my clients. It is not allowed for you to take your girlfriend with you to go visit this dog. This is not a visit. This is a job you're doing. And this dog knows you, does not know your girlfriend. And if something happens to her or something happens to their house, it's not you who's liable. It's me. Right. And it's just, you need, and besides that, this is your job. This is not a social visit for you. Yeah. I'm paying you to go do this, so you need to do this in an appropriate fashion. And so I think you're right. You need to be aware of the fact that you are the one who is ultimately responsible for all this. And if you don't take that responsibility, it's going to be thrust upon you whether you like it or not.
But I do like what you're bringing up too, because a lot of teenagers and a lot of kids are being hired as pet sitters, are going on visits. It's something that commonly is done. I see advertisements for it all the time. And I think that you raise a really important point that, if your child, your teenager is taking on those jobs, that mentioning to them that is only for them, that this is not about, when they're going to let those several German Shepherds out, it's not really for their friend to come along and pal around with. that is their responsibility. And I think that that's our job as parents, is to also remind them of that if they are taking on those kind of responsibilities outside of our own home as well,
Right.
Yes.
which they do. Mine do.
And for the kids to hear that we're not saying that their kids would be inappropriate in the client's house, which I think is what a lot of kids jump toward. Like, well, he would never do anything there.
Right.
Or she wouldn't take anything. Like, no. We want the dogs to be comfortable. We want the system to be the same. We want the routine for the dog. This isn't about, that this is a bad person you're introducing into the home. Just, this is change, and we're not allowed to make that change. You were hired for the job.
Because what if the dog decides for whatever reason they don't like your friend, and now your friend is bitten? Who's responsible here?
Yeah.
Are you going to sue the homeowner for the medical? You're making, $8 an hour. You're not paying for the medical. Does it fall under my umbrella policy? Stuff happens that we don't count on. Or what if it's icy and your friend slips on the front steps and breaks a leg? Not even everything to do with the dog. Where does the responsibility, where's the liability lie?
Julie and I sometimes think that we're the biggest doom and gloom people of all time. And here again we go. Watch out. Watch out. Watch out.
But
oh, dear.
I know.
But
I think being aware is really important.
Yes. Colleen and I have decided that our podcast, our goal in podcasting, is to not make any money and to spread the doom and gloom wherever we can. But the one thing I will say is that what I also love about teenagers with kids, with dogs, is that when you have a teenager that's fully engaged with a dog, there's nothing sort of as enchanting as watching them, run together or play ball together, or, snuggle on the couch and eat popcorn and watch, the Avengers together.
Yes.
So it's an enchanting and wonderful age as well. And I think this is not so much about how teenagers are really bad and don't take care of dogs, but it's more like, parents, you need to remember that there's still challenges when your kids are teenagers with your dogs. And it's up to you to rise to the challenges so that it is successful with your teenagers and the dog, so that they do have those great times on the couch together and playing together and being together. So it's really just a reminder that we still need to parent.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that actually makes me think of in Fairfax County schools for the lower grades, the report card is divided into halves. The top half is all academic and the bottom half is more social and behavioral. And one of the best teachers that we encountered through the years said the top half is interesting, but the bottom half is who you are. And the bottom half is what we want to be thinking about. And I think with teenagers, sometimes we get hung up on the SAT scores and how are you doing in chemistry? And oh my gosh, what's next? But in their interactions with our family pets, we can really see that bottom half, how you behave and are you responsible and are you kind and are you the kind of person that I really believe you are. And so sometimes I think as parents, we forget to focus on the bottom half during those crazy, hectic teenage years. So that's kind of where you were headed with that, or at least that's what triggered for me when you were saying that.
Definitely.
Well, that's great. Okay, I think that's a positive note, so we can probably end this because we
No, and it's so great it is great to see the relationships, and it is great to have the support of a family dog and companion. I know that as a teenager, that was one of the highlights of my life, was having my dog. So that bond and that having that friend, that buddy, that unconditional, there's nothing greater than it. So, there can be some struggles, but I think in the end, it's all very positive, just like any other age.
Yes. Yeah. And I can remember with my younger daughter, who had a golden retriever when she was a kid, that if one of the things that was, if Emma was having a hard day, there was nothing like taking her dog for a long walk that would help her to refocus and regroup and come back to being somewhere on the civil part of life.
Very true. Or running in the yard.
That connection of sometimes actually having the responsibility of caring for something is one of the ways in which teenagers can get outside of their angst and outside of themselves, to realize that there's something beyond me, and a dog or a family pet can be a great way to do that.
Absolutely.
I think that's terrific. Well, thank you, Jen. I think that was a really interesting discussion, and I think brings up some good points. The idea that, we still need to keep in mind that we're parents to our kids and to our dogs, basically for the rest of your life. I mean, once you're a parent, you never stop parenting, but it just changes in nature. So
definitely.
All right. Well, thanks. And we'll see you next time. All right.
Thanks for listening to Your Family Dog. Got questions? Interesting ideas? Colleen and Julie would love to hear them. Call 614-349-1661 or visit www.yourfamilydogpodcast.com to share your thoughts.